In every relationship, no matter how deep the love or how strong the bond, there exists a hidden layer beneath the surface, a psychological undercurrent that most people ignore until it begins to shape the entire dynamic. This layer is the shadow that silently influences emotions, reactions, and decisions. It's not always dark in the traditional sense, but it is unconscious and therefore powerful. The shadow within relationships is made up of everything people suppress, deny, or fail to acknowledge about themselves and others. It's the unspoken resentments, the subtle insecurities, the unmet expectations, and the emotional wounds carried from the past. It is not visible in everyday conversations, but it quietly determines how individuals see and treat one another. The early stages of any relationship are often marked by idealization. People see what they want to see. They project their hopes, desires, and fantasies onto the other person, often overlooking their flaws or complexities. This is not deception, it is human nature. The mind instinctively filters reality to preserve emotional security. But as time passes and the illusion fades, the shadow begins to emerge. It reveals itself through small irritations, unexplained emotional shifts, and sudden judgments. What was once charming can become annoying. What was once overlooked can turn into a source of tension. The shadow is not created in that moment. It was always there, waiting for awareness to dim so it could rise. One of the most powerful elements of the hidden shadow is projection. When people refuse to confront their own insecurities or traits, they often unconsciously project them onto others. A person who fears being controlled might accuse their partner of being controlling. Someone who struggles with jealousy might become hypersensitive to their partner's interactions with others. These projections are not logical, they are emotional defenses. The shadow operates like a mirror that reflects back the parts of ourselves we would rather not see. And in relationships, this mirror can become distorted, leading to misunderstandings, misplaced blame, and silent resentment. Another dimension of the shadow lies in unspoken expectations. Every individual carries within them an internal script of how relationships should unfold. These scripts are shaped by childhood experiences, cultural narratives, personal values, and past relationships. Often, these expectations are never clearly communicated, yet they govern behavior. When one partner unconsciously expects constant validation, emotional availability, or unquestioning support, and the other partner fails to meet those unspoken needs, frustration builds. This frustration is rarely expressed directly at first. It hides beneath polite smiles, small criticisms, or emotional withdrawal. Over time, these quiet disappointments accumulate, forming a reservoir of shadow energy that influences how both people interact. The shadow also thrives in unacknowledged emotional wounds. Many people enter relationships carrying pain from their past, betrayals, neglect, abandonment, or rejection. Even if these wounds seem forgotten, they remain stored in the unconscious, waiting to be triggered. A harmless comment, a delayed reply, a slight change in tone can unexpectedly reopen old wounds. But instead of recognizing this pain as their own, individuals often attribute it to the other person's actions. This creates emotional confusion. The partner becomes both a source of comfort and a trigger for unresolved trauma. The shadow thrives in this confusion, feeding on emotional ambiguity and making genuine communication more difficult. Silence is another way the shadow manifests. Not every conflict is fought with raised voices. Sometimes It hides in quiet moments, in the things that are left unsaid. When a person feels hurt but chooses not to speak, when they sense something is wrong but decide to ignore it, when they put on a mask of composure while quietly stewing inside, this is the shadow at work. It turns silence into a container for unresolved emotions. And the longer those emotions stay unaddressed, the more they ferment, altering the emotional atmosphere of the relationship in subtle but profound ways. The hidden shadow can also appear through power dynamics. Every relationship involves an ongoing negotiation of control, influence, and emotional power. Sometimes one person becomes the dominant emotional center, while the other adapts or retreats. This imbalance may not be intentional, but it shapes the relationship's foundation. Over time, the person who feels unheard or unseen may develop a quiet form of resistance, harboring unspoken frustrations. The dominant partner, on the other hand, may unconsciously ignore the other's emotional reality, deepening the divide. The shadow is not just about individual psychology, it's also about the invisible structures that shape how people connect. Even the way people handle love and affection is influenced by the shadow. Many believe love should be unconditional, yet unconsciously they attach conditions, expecting their partner to behave a certain way, meet certain needs, or fill certain emotional gaps. When reality doesn't match these hidden conditions, disappointment takes root. This disappointment is rarely discussed openly. Instead, it hides behind rationalizations, justifications, or emotional detachment. The shadow doesn't speak in clear language. It communicates through moods, passive, aggressive remarks, sudden emotional distance, or inexplicable coldness. The most challenging aspect of the hidden shadow within relationships is that it's mutual. It doesn't belong to one person alone. Each partner brings their own shadow into the relationship, and these shadows interact, sometimes colliding, sometimes intertwining. This interaction creates a complex emotional web where neither person is fully aware of the forces at play. Arguments erupt over trivial matters because they are never truly about those matters. They are about deeper, unspoken issues. Emotional walls are built without conscious intent. Trust begins to erode not because of major betrayals, but because of small, continuous shadow interactions that slowly reshape the bond. Understanding the hidden shadow within relationships requires honesty, courage, and self-reflection. It demands looking beyond surface behaviors and questioning the deeper motives, fears, and wounds that drive them. It involves recognizing projections, acknowledging expectations, and facing emotional pain without deflecting it onto the other person. This kind of awareness is not easy because it strips away comforting illusions and forces individuals to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves and their relationships. But without this awareness, the shadow continues to govern interactions from the background, influencing emotions, decisions, and the overall trajectory of the relationship in ways that remain unseen yet deeply felt. Human emotions are not passive experiences that simply appear and disappear at will. They are powerful forces that demand acknowledgement, movement, and expression. When feelings are suppressed, they don't dissolve into nothingness. Instead, they retreat into the unconscious, where they continue to live, grow, and seek alternate paths to surface. Suppressed emotions behave like trapped energy, building pressure over time until they find a way to express themselves, often in ways that are indirect, unexpected, or even destructive, This is why moments of sudden emotional outbursts, seemingly irrational reactions, or unexplained sadness often have roots in emotions that were once buried instead of addressed. From childhood, many people are conditioned to hide their feelings. Whether it's being told to stop crying, to toughen up, or to avoid conflict, emotional suppression becomes a learned survival strategy. In families where vulnerability is seen as weakness, or where emotional expression is met with punishment, children quickly learn to tuck away their true feelings in order to stay safe. These early patterns don't disappear in adulthood, they evolve. Adults often wear emotional masks, pretending to be composed while quietly wrestling with a storm inside. This silent battle creates psychological tension as the natural flow of emotion is interrupted, forcing it to find unconventional outlets. Suppressed emotions can manifest physically. The body is not separate from the mind. It remembers what the conscious mind tries to forget. Tension in the shoulders, chronic fatigue, headaches, digestive issues, or sudden mood swings can often be traced back to unprocessed emotional experiences. For example, prolonged anger that is never expressed may turn inward, manifesting as irritability, restlessness, or even physical inflammation. Grief that's buried may emerge as numbness, detachment, or sudden emotional breakdowns triggered by minor events. The human psyche finds creative ways to signal that something has been left unresolved, and if ignored, these signals often intensify over time. Another way suppressed emotions seek expression is through behavioral patterns. People might find themselves repeating certain relational dynamics without understanding why. For instance, someone who suppressed anger toward a neglectful parent may unconsciously attract relationships with emotionally unavailable partners. Each new relationship becomes an arena where the old, unexpressed emotions try to resolve themselves through repetition. This phenomenon often confuses people because they believe they've moved on from the past, not realizing that suppressed emotions act like magnets, pulling them toward situations that mirror their original wounds, offering an unconscious opportunity for resolution. The subconscious does not accept silence indefinitely. It whispers first through subtle feelings of discomfort or fleeting thoughts. If those whispers are ignored, it speaks louder through recurring emotional triggers, nightmares, or sudden mood changes. Eventually, it may shout through breakdowns, crises, or emotional outbursts that seem to appear out of nowhere. But these moments are not random. They are the psyche's attempt to bring the suppressed emotion to the surface so it can finally be seen and processed. Suppressed emotions also find expression through projection. When a person cannot accept or acknowledge a feeling within themselves, they may unconsciously attribute it to someone else. A person who feels jealousy but refuses to admit it might perceive others as envious or competitive. Someone who has unresolved anger may constantly accuse others of being hostile. Projection allows the emotion to exist in the external world where it feels safer to engage with, rather than facing it internally where it feels threatening. This psychological mechanism can create misunderstandings in relationships as people react not to reality, but to their own unacknowledged feelings reflected back at them. Another subtle form of emotional expression occurs through creative outlets. People who cannot voice their pain might channel it into music, art, writing, or other forms of creativity. These outlets act as safe containers for suppressed emotions, giving them form without requiring direct confrontation. A song might carry the weight of years of heartbreak. A painting may hold anger that was never spoken. Creative expression is one of the healthiest ways suppressed emotions can find release. But even here, if the core feelings remain unacknowledged, the cycle of suppression continues beneath the surface. Interpersonal communication often reveals hidden emotional undercurrents. Sarcasm, passive-aggressive remarks, or sudden emotional withdrawals are often signs of emotions that are trying to surface indirectly. When someone says, "I'm fine," through clenched teeth, the emotion is not gone, it's waiting. When someone avoids confrontation repeatedly, their silence begins to speak louder than words. Over time, suppressed emotions shape how people communicate, creating tension, misunderstandings, and emotional distance in relationships. Suppression can also alter self-perception. When individuals consistently deny their feelings, they lose touch with their authentic emotional selves. They may begin to see themselves as someone who doesn't get angry, doesn't care, or can handle anything, when in truth they have simply become skilled at numbing. This disconnect can lead to feelings of emptiness or confusion about one's identity, because emotions are essential signals that help people understand their needs, values, and boundaries. Without those signals, a person may drift through life reacting to buried emotions without understanding why they feel what they feel. One of the most telling signs of suppressed emotions seeking expression is overreaction to minor events. A small criticism triggers disproportionate rage. A tiny inconvenience leads to overwhelming frustration. A casual comment brings unexpected tears. These moments are not about the present situation. They are emotional echoes of the past, moments when similar feelings were suppressed rather than expressed. The current event simply acts as a spark to a pile of emotional kindling that has been gathering for years. Socially, suppressed emotions can ripple outward, influencing group dynamics and collective behavior. Entire families, workplaces, or communities can carry suppressed emotional currents that shape their culture. For example, in a family where sadness is never discussed, generations may grow up emotionally distant, using humor or distraction to cover pain. In workplaces where expressing frustration is discouraged, silent resentment can build among employees, eventually leading to conflict or disengagement. Suppressed emotions are contagious. They spread through tone, energy, and unspoken behavior, influencing others without a single word being said. Suppressing emotions may feel safer in the short term, but the psyche is wired for wholeness. Every feeling carries a message, and until that message is acknowledged, the emotion will continue to seek expression through any available channel. Whether through the body, behavior, projection, relationships, creativity, or crisis, the energy of suppressed emotions never disappears. It simply changes form, waiting for the right moment to emerge and demand recognition. Resentment rarely appears suddenly. It develops quietly, layer by layer, in the hidden spaces of the mind where unspoken feelings gather. Most people don't even realize it's forming until it begins to influence their tone, their reactions, and the way they perceive others. This is the nature of unconscious resentment. It is not declared openly, but it grows steadily, like a slow-moving current beneath an otherwise calm surface. At its core, resentment is a response to repeated experiences of hurt, disappointment, or perceived injustice that were never fully expressed or resolved. Each time a boundary is crossed, a need is ignored, or a feeling is dismissed, A small seed of resentment is planted. Over time, these seeds take root and create an emotional landscape that can shape the entire dynamic of a relationship or environment. The unconscious build-up of resentment often begins with small moments that seem insignificant at first. A careless remark, a forgotten promise, a dismissive gesture. These moments may not feel big enough to confront directly, so people brush them aside, telling themselves it's not worth making a fuss. But the emotional impact doesn't disappear just because the mind decides to ignore it. It lingers often unnoticed until the next similar moment occurs. Each new incident adds another layer to the emotional sediment forming beneath the surface. This build-up is particularly common in close relationships, where maintaining harmony feels more important than addressing discomfort. People convince themselves that staying silent is a form of kindness, that letting things go will preserve peace. But what they are really doing is preserving the appearance of peace while resentment quietly accumulates in the background. Over weeks, months, or even years, these unacknowledged grievances form a psychological reservoir that eventually begins to seep into daily interactions. Unconscious resentment thrives in environments where emotional expression is discouraged or misunderstood. In some families, speaking up is equated with disrespect. In certain cultures, expressing personal hurt is seen as weakness. In workplaces, asserting boundaries can be misinterpreted as insubordination. In such settings, people learn to internalize their negative emotions rather than communicate them. They smile, nod, and continue outwardly, while inwardly collecting emotional debts that are never repaid. The more these emotional debts accumulate, the heavier the internal burden becomes. Another factor that fuels the unconscious build-up of resentment is expectation without communication. Many people enter relationships with silent expectations of how others should behave, treat them, or meet their needs. When these expectations are not met, frustration arises, but instead of articulating the disappointment, they suppress it, hoping the other person will somehow just know. Over time, unmet expectations turn into emotional charges that contribute to resentment's growth. The unspoken nature of these expectations makes them particularly insidious because the other person often has no idea they are violating anything at all. Psychologically, resentment builds unconsciously because the mind seeks to avoid discomfort. Confronting hurt requires vulnerability, and vulnerability can be frightening. It involves acknowledging pain, risking rejection, and challenging the status quo. By contrast, suppressing feelings and carrying on requires no immediate confrontation, making it a tempting short-term solution. However, the emotional cost accumulates over time, and what began as small frustrations can evolve into deeply entrenched resentment that colors every interaction. The unconscious mind is like a storage room for unresolved emotions. Every unspoken frustration is stored away, but it's not stored neatly. These feelings sit there, influencing thought patterns, emotional responses, and even physical sensations. For example, someone who unconsciously resents a friend's constant lateness may start feeling irritated around that friend even in unrelated situations. They might become less patient, less affectionate, or more prone to sarcasm without fully understanding why. The resentment leaks out indirectly, often confusing both parties involved. Body language is one of the earliest indicators that resentment is building beneath the surface. A slight eye roll, a forced smile, crossed arms, or subtle withdrawal in physical proximity can communicate what words do not. The body often betrays the feelings the conscious mind is trying to hide. Over time, these physical cues become habitual, shaping the emotional tone of interactions even when no overt conflict occurs. Resentment also influences inner narratives. When people repeatedly experience unresolved hurt, their minds begin to craft stories about the other person's character. They never listen. They don't respect me. They always put themselves first. These stories act as cognitive shortcuts that reinforce the emotional state of resentment. Instead of seeing each new incident objectively, the mind filters experiences through the lens of these narratives, making the resentment feel justified and inevitable. One of the most subtle aspects of unconscious resentment is emotional withdrawal. Instead of expressing anger or hurt, individuals may begin to pull back emotionally. They share less, open up less, and invest less energy into the relationship. This withdrawal often happens gradually, almost imperceptibly, but it can drastically alter the relational dynamic over time. The affected person may not even realize they are withdrawing. It feels like a natural response to avoid further hurt. But this distancing reinforces the resentment, creating a self-perpetuating cycle where emotional connection weakens and grievances deepen. Unconscious resentment can also manifest through passive-aggressive behaviors. When people feel unable or unwilling to confront issues directly, they may express their frustration indirectly through sarcasm, subtle sabotage, withholding affection, or deliberately procrastinating on requests. These behaviors provide a temporary sense of control and expression, but do nothing to resolve the underlying issues. In fact, they often create new conflicts that add even more fuel to the growing resentment. Another layer of complexity comes from the accumulation of historical grievances. People rarely resent a single incident, they resent the pattern. Each unaddressed hurt connects to previous ones, forming a chain that stretches back through time. When a new incident occurs, it doesn't just trigger the present moment, it awakens the entire history of similar experiences stored in the unconscious. This is why a seemingly minor disagreement can sometimes provoke a disproportionate reaction. The reaction isn't just to the present situation, but to years of accumulated emotional residue. The build-up of unconscious resentment affects both individuals and relationships in profound ways. For individuals, it can lead to chronic irritability, emotional numbness, or feelings of disconnection. For relationships, it erodes trust, intimacy, and genuine communication. Because the resentment is largely unspoken, both parties often sense something is wrong, but can't quite name it. This creates confusion, emotional distance, and an atmosphere of unspoken tension that shapes every interaction moving forward. Many relationships operate under a quiet, carefully maintained illusion of peace. On the surface, everything appears calm, there are no loud arguments, no confrontations, and everyone seems to get along. Smiles are exchanged, polite words are spoken, and routines continue smoothly. But beneath this fragile surface often lies a complex web of unspoken frustrations, unresolved conflicts, and emotional disconnection. This is the illusion of peace, a deceptive calm that masks the reality of tension brewing underneath. It gives the appearance of harmony while concealing the emotional storms that are quietly gathering strength in the background. The illusion of peace often emerges because people fear confrontation. They equate conflict with chaos, assuming that avoiding difficult conversations will maintain stability. Instead of addressing hurt feelings or unmet needs, they choose silence, hoping that time will naturally smooth things over. This strategy can work temporarily, creating the appearance of order, but it does not address the underlying issues. Like cracks in a wall covered with fresh paint, the problems remain beneath the surface, waiting for pressure to expose them again. In many families, this illusion is carefully cultivated over years. Members are taught, either explicitly or implicitly, that speaking uncomfortable truths disrupts unity. Children may grow up watching adults avoid real conversations, learning that silence equals harmony. In workplaces, teams often avoid necessary discussions to preserve a sense of cooperation, even when frustrations are simmering quietly. In friendships and romantic partnerships, individuals may choose to let things go, to prevent drama, even when something meaningful remains unresolved. Over time, these patterns form emotional habits that keep everyone locked inside a shared illusion. The reality, however, is that tension does not disappear simply because it's ignored. Emotional energy doesn't vanish, it accumulates. Every unspoken disappointment, every unacknowledged hurt, every avoided conversation adds to an invisible emotional pressure. This pressure doesn't always manifest in obvious ways, but it can be felt in the stiffness of interactions, in the hesitations before speaking, in the subtle distance that grows between people. The air becomes thick with what is not being said, and even the smallest interaction can feel emotionally charged. This emotional tension often reveals itself through nonverbal cues long before it is ever verbalized. Body language tightens, eye contact becomes brief, laughter sounds forced, and moments of silence stretch longer than they should. People might avoid being alone together to prevent uncomfortable conversations. Shared spaces may feel cold or awkward, even though everyone pretends that nothing is wrong. These subtle signs are the language of tension, spoken through gestures and atmospheres rather than words. The illusion of peace is maintained through emotional masks. People learn to say the right things, smile at the right times, and keep their true feelings tucked away. They might respond with, "It's fine," when it's not. They might give polite nods instead of honest feedback. Over time, these masks become habitual, creating a shared performance that everyone participates in, even if they secretly know it's not real. This performance requires emotional energy to sustain, which often leads to exhaustion, detachment, or feelings of inauthenticity. One of the reasons this illusion persists is that it offers short-term comfort. Real conversations can be uncomfortable, vulnerable, and unpredictable. Pretending everything is fine avoids that discomfort in the moment. But this avoidance comes with a cost. The longer tensions are left unaddressed, the more they shape the relationship in subtle, often unconscious ways. Trust erodes quietly. Emotional closeness fades. People start assuming things about each other's intentions rather than clarifying misunderstandings. The connection weakens, not through explosive arguments, but through a slow, steady drifting apart. A particularly dangerous aspect of the illusion of peace is that it can make people believe the relationship is stronger than it actually is. Because there are no visible conflicts, they assume there are no problems. They mistake silence for stability, when in fact, silence may simply mean that everyone has stopped trying to be fully honest. This false sense of security can lead to shock when suppressed issues eventually surface, often during moments of crisis when emotions can no longer be contained. The reality of tension is complex because it doesn't always present itself dramatically. Tension can exist quietly for years, shaping behaviors and decisions without ever being openly acknowledged. In friendships, it can show up as reduced enthusiasm, less communication, or emotional distance that slowly grows over time. In families, it may manifest as strained gatherings where everyone follows unspoken rules about what can and cannot be discussed. In romantic relationships, it can turn intimacy into routine, where conversations feel shallow and interactions feel scripted, even though no major fights are happening. Psychologically, people are often more sensitive to emotional undercurrents than they realize. Even if nothing is said aloud, individuals pick up on changes in tone, body language, and energy. These subtle cues trigger instinctive responses. Tension breeds more tension as people mirror each other's guardedness. A relationship that exists in this state becomes emotionally fragile. One small disagreement or unexpected stressor can suddenly bring all the hidden tension to the surface, resulting in conflicts that feel explosive precisely because they were ignored for so long. Maintaining the illusion of peace also creates internal dissonance. People know, consciously or unconsciously, that something is wrong. But because they keep pretending everything is fine, their external behavior clashes with their internal reality. This mismatch creates stress, irritability, and emotional fatigue. Over time, it can lead to passive-aggressive behavior, silent resentment, or emotional shutdown. Individuals may withdraw into themselves, creating even more distance while outwardly maintaining the same routines. The illusion of peace becomes even more entrenched when roles and patterns solidify. For example, in some dynamics, one person becomes the peacekeeper, always smoothing things over and avoiding confrontation, while another becomes the avoider, refusing to engage emotionally. These roles become predictable, and everyone learns to play their part. But beneath these roles, tension continues to grow, unaddressed and unresolved, shaping the emotional climate in ways no one openly discusses. The longer this illusion persists, the more dangerous it becomes, because unaddressed tension doesn't simply fade away with time, it transforms. What begins as mild discomfort can harden into resentment, mistrust, or emotional indifference. People start to emotionally disengage, not because they don't care, but because caring becomes too painful in an environment where honesty is stifled. Conversations become superficial, interactions become transactional, and the once vibrant emotional connection starts to dull into routine coexistence. The illusion of peace offers a temporary sense of control, but the reality of tension always remains underneath, shaping the emotional architecture of the relationship in invisible but powerful ways. This quiet tension eventually influences how people think, speak, and behave around each other, often determining the trajectory of the relationship without anyone fully realizing it. There comes a moment in many strained relationships when silence changes its nature. In the beginning, quiet might serve as a protective barrier, a way to avoid escalation or a space for reflection. But over time, if emotions remain unaddressed and communication breaks down, that same quiet begins to harden. It shifts from being a shield to becoming a strategy, from passive withdrawal to active control. This is the turning point, the moment when silence becomes weaponized. It stops being an absence of words and turns into a deliberate psychological tool, reshaping the emotional balance between people in subtle but powerful ways. Weaponized silence is rarely loud or dramatic. It operates in the invisible spaces of relationships. It is the text left unanswered, the gaze deliberately averted, the prolonged coldness that lingers after a disagreement. It communicates not through speech, but through absence. Unlike genuine silence, which can foster understanding and introspection, weaponized silence aims to send a message, control the narrative, or assert dominance. It is silence with intent, often used to punish, manipulate, or protect one's ego while avoiding vulnerability. This transformation often begins when one person feels that their words are no longer effective, safe, or valued. Instead of expressing anger, sadness, or frustration directly, they retreat into silence, believing that withholding communication will create impact. For some, this strategy emerges as a response to feeling powerless. For others, it's a way to regain emotional control. The quiet becomes a form of leverage. By refusing to engage, the silent person shifts the psychological pressure onto the other, forcing them to guess, interpret, or react to the void. In romantic relationships, weaponized silence often takes the form of the silent treatment. One partner withdraws emotionally and communicatively, leaving the other in a state of confusion and emotional isolation. This isn't the same as needing space to cool down. Weaponized silence is calculated. It withholds warmth, attention, or acknowledgement to induce guilt, anxiety, or compliance. It's a way of saying, I won't give you my voice until you give me what I want, without ever uttering the words aloud. This dynamic can be deeply destabilizing because the targeted partner feels trapped in an emotional maze, trying to decode what went wrong while receiving no clear information. In friendships or family relationships, weaponized silence may appear as intentional disengagement. A friend stops reaching out, responding only with curt replies, or deliberately excludes the other from conversations. A parent may use silence to express disapproval without explaining why. A sibling might ignore calls as a way of showing anger. In all these cases, the silence isn't neutral, it's purposeful. It carries an emotional charge designed to communicate something indirectly, often leaving the other person feeling unsettled, guilty, or rejected. One of the most insidious aspects of weaponized silence is its ability to create psychological imbalance. Humans are wired for social connection, and silence in close relationships is naturally unsettling. When someone deliberately withholds communication, it activates uncertainty and self-doubt in the other. They may start questioning their actions, replaying past conversations, or overanalyzing every small detail to figure out what caused the shift. This mental loop gives the silent person a subtle form of power. By saying nothing, they control the emotional atmosphere and the other person's attention. Weaponized silence can also emerge in power imbalanced relationships. For example, in workplaces, a superior might use silence to assert authority, refusing to provide feedback or acknowledge someone's efforts, leaving them in a constant state of uncertainty. In families, a dominant figure might use silence to remind others of their control. In these situations, silence becomes a form of psychological pressure, maintaining hierarchy and keeping others in a state of emotional dependence. Unlike direct confrontation, weaponized silence is difficult to address because it's ambiguous. The silent person can always claim they just needed space or didn't know what to say. This plausible deniability makes it hard for the targeted person to call out the behavior without seeming unreasonable. The ambiguity is part of its power. It allows the silent person to inflict emotional discomfort while avoiding responsibility for it. This ambiguity often leads to emotional exhaustion as the affected person struggles to navigate an interaction where the usual rules of communication no longer apply. Over time, weaponized silence can reshape the emotional climate of a relationship. When silence becomes a habitual tool, both parties adapt their behavior around it. The targeted person might become hyper vigilant, carefully choosing their words to avoid triggering another withdrawal. They may overcompensate, offering apologies or concessions just to break the silence. Meanwhile, the silent person may grow accustomed to the control their quiet gives them, using it more frequently to navigate conflicts. The relationship begins to revolve around the presence or absence of communication rather than genuine understanding. Psychologically, weaponized silence often stems from unresolved emotional pain or fear. People may weaponize silence because they fear vulnerability, rejection, or loss of control. Speaking honestly requires courage and emotional exposure, while silence provides a sense of safety and superiority. It allows individuals to avoid uncomfortable conversations while still expressing displeasure. But the protective layer of silence eventually becomes a barrier that prevents true emotional connection. The person using silence may not even fully realize how their behavior impacts the other. To them, it might feel like self-protection, while to the other, it feels like abandonment or punishment. Another consequence of weaponized silence is that it intensifies underlying tensions rather than resolving them. Silence doesn't make the conflict disappear, it magnifies it in the mind of the person on the receiving end. Every hour of unacknowledged quiet becomes heavier, every unanswered message sharper. The emotional distance widens, and assumptions fill the void where communication should be. Misunderstandings grow, resentment builds, and both individuals start to inhabit parallel emotional worlds, connected by shared history, but separated by a wall of intentional quiet. Over time, the turning point where quiet becomes weaponized fundamentally alters the psychological balance between individuals. What was once a neutral or even healing silence turns into a tool for control, avoidance, or emotional retaliation. The dynamic becomes less about mutual understanding and more about who can hold the silence longer, who can endure the discomfort, and who will break first. In this silent struggle, words are no longer the primary means of communication. Power is conveyed through withdrawal, and emotional impact is delivered through absence rather than presence